Good afternoon, you guys. This is Damon again, your instructor for anatomy and physiology. I haven't been on for a while in terms of a video, so I thought I'd pop in, especially with our exams coming up this weekend. A couple of you have asked what you can do, how you can prepare for both the lecture and the lab exam coming up between June 3rd and June 4th is when you can take both of those. So I thought I'd share a couple of ideas with you for what you can do. A lot of it comes down to the idea that I often give people is that you have to do something with your notes. Many people are familiar with doing the traditional types of activities to start to become proficient with material. They will, in your case, access the videos and they will watch and listen to the video. And of course you need to be taking notes during that time as well. The problem is a lot of times we think that that's enough, that I've done what I was supposed to. And I have listened, I have watched, and I have written, and therefore that should mean enough for me to know this material well enough to be tested on it. And for most people that's just not the case. So it does take more time and more effort to really know something that's new to you. The question becomes then, are you willing to put in the time and effort? So if you are, here are some ideas for you to do. I've mentioned to all of you about the importance of flashcards. It's an old-fashioned technique. We've all probably done them before, and maybe you've been doing them already, but a class like this definitely sets itself up well for note cards, flashcards. It's a lot of memorization, a lot of terms with descriptions or information tied to those terms. And so breaking it down into small bits of information can be really helpful. One thing to know about flashcards is that it's the making of them that is actually the most helpful part. You don't want to ever borrow someone else's flashcards, download them off of the internet. It's not the same at all. It's your act of thinking of ideas from your notes, putting them on a small card or piece of paper, and then deciding on the back side, what do I need to know about that term? It's that thought process of you creating it, watching yourself write it, deciding if that seems to be enough. That in itself is a huge part of studying. So it does take time, but it's not time that's taking away from your studying when you create flashcards. It actually is studying. Of course, the second part of that is using the flashcards. And this is where my comments about repetition come in. Studying anatomy definitely on a daily basis, and I do mean 7 days a week, is really helpful for remembering this stuff. As well as quantity of time. I recommend about an hour to an hour and a half a day on average for people. Some might need and want more, some may not need that amount, but that's a good starting point. And then trying to see if you can do that amount of time, 1 hour, 1.5, 2 hours a day, in a couple of times throughout that day and not just all at once, like at night before you go to bed. A lot of times we save something like this till the very end of our day, and then we try to do it when our brains are at our worst. So flashcards, let me show you something. So here's an example, and I hope this looks correct to you. On my screen it's backwards, but I think Google will correct this when I submit it. So here's a flashcard that I made that has something that you guys are supposed to know about. So you may have come up with and said, I need to know about the different types of tissues, right, from our tissue chapter. So you might think, I'm going to write a card that says epithelial tissues. I need to know about them. I need to know the term, and then I need to know stuff about epithelial tissues. So let me show you what I've written on the back. So this is what I find a lot of my students when I have them in class. When I take a look, this is what they'll write down. They'll say, I wrote down a card for epithelial tissues and I put it covers surfaces. And so while that's true, that's a pretty simplistic note card. And it's leaving out a lot of information that belongs with the idea of epithelial tissues. So a lot of times I find students just try to blurt, do 1 or 2 on the back side and think that they've covered that topic, and that's just not the case. Here's a better example of one that's epithelial tissue. So I have that on this side. And then just sitting here, I tried to come up with some of the things I know are on your videos and should be in your notes. Covers and lines surfaces, right? Sorry, it's backwards for me. It's avascular, meaning it has no blood supply. That's important to know. Protects, absorbs, and secretes. There are a couple other functions for it as well, but those are some of the things you should know. I also noticed from the notes it is composed, now this is more in lab, but it belongs here too. It's composed of either squamous, cuboidal, or columnar shaped cells. So that would be a good thing to tag on here. That'll help you in lab too. And it can occur in different layers such as stratified, simple, or pseudostratified. So all of that, this is a much more robust note card, so that when I come across it like this in my own pile and say epithelial tissue and wonder, what did I write on the back? What did I decide I needed to know? I've got a lot to cover, but if I can get to that, there's a lot of information, a lot of questions I could answer by knowing what's on the back of this. Don't forget, if you've got friends and family too, once you've created these, they can easily help you by just holding it up and not letting you cheat by flipping it around when you're all by yourself and saying, that's what I would have said. Yeah, oh, I remember that. Remember, it's not a test about, do you remember talking about A, B, and C? Those are easy tests. That's not what we have. Instead, it's, can you recall information when I don't prompt you? So that's a good way to make flashcards. I've had students have huge stacks of flashcards for each chapter. And it's the making and then the studying of those that's really helped them. Another thing you can do is to consider turning your note information maybe into chart or table form where it seems appropriate. So for example, I noticed that when we cover the skin, there's a layer called the epidermis, and that there's a breakdown of the layers of the epidermis. So I thought it might be helpful to, instead of just writing word after word after word or just making flashcards, I thought maybe if I arrange this into a table to see things and how they're related, that might help me remember them too. So I considered putting down the 5 different layers. I gave myself 5 rows here. And then I wrote down, what should I know about the cells in that layer? What else about the description? So as you probably know, here I might put the deepest one, the stratum basale. Right? I might write that, stratum basale here. I would put down the different variety of cells and what they do, and I would mention too, this is the deepest layer of the epidermis, and then I would follow and go all the way through. So it's just another way to organize your information is into chart or table form. A third thing you might consider doing is, if you like to doodle or draw, do illustrations. They don't have to be pretty, but here's one I came up with about atomic structure. Just real quick, I drew some symbols and some things to show me, to remind myself where things are and what's important about them. So here I drew an atom, and I drew some subatomic particles here in the middle, and I drew some orbiting around. And then I pulled out, I used a positive symbol for those balls for the protons, I left the neutrons blank, and I did a negative symbol in those balls. And then I drew some arrows out, and I have yet to fill all this in with what I need to know, but I gave you some idea about what I think should belong there. So it's just another way you might remember a picture like this that you drew yourself when you're taking a test. Lastly, another final or really good tip would be to, every time you have a full page of notes, is to consider taking out a separate sheet of paper and writing a whole bunch of questions that your notes are the answers for, because that's basically what I do for the exam. So for example, real quick on this piece of paper, I wrote down the term homeostasis from chapter 1. And it says homeostasis is a tendency and ability to maintain a stable internal environment. Okay, so maybe I had that in my notes, the definition of that term. I also might have had, similarly, in a negative feedback mechanism, the body has to have 1, an established normal range for a characteristic, 2, the ability to detect when things are out of the normal range, and 3, the ability to respond to negate the changes and return things back to normal. So that's just a sample of what somebody might have written down for the idea of negative feedback mechanisms. So on another sheet of paper, for me it's on the back, I did this. I looked and I said, there's a word, I need to know what it means. So I'm going to ask myself, what is the definition of homeostasis? What are the 3 parts of a negative feedback mechanism? And the nice thing about that is then you can't just look at the answers when it's on another sheet of paper and nod your head and say, yep, that's what I thought. For me, it's on the back. I can't see my answers. So if I can't answer this, that's okay, because it's not the day of the test. But that's okay, but I want to mark that and say, clearly, I need to study that some more. So same is true with flashcards. You might want to make a pile of those that you got right on the back. You're like, you nailed it, right? So that goes in a pile of ones you seem to know pretty well. And make a pile of the ones you struggled with. And study that stuff and come back to them. And then try it again and see if your completed pile gets taller and taller. And do go back to the completed ones too. Just because you remembered it today doesn't mean you'll remember it on Friday or Saturday. So those are some tips for you. It's a lot of work, and sometimes that's part of the class too, is people realizing that they need to often put in more time than they have been. It's a hard class. There's a lot to memorize. In terms of the lab exam, the spelling is really important. I've been going through and trying to give back a few points for people on the lab quizzes, so you may see your grade might have changed in your favor. But on the exams, we really hold you to the spelling, so you have to do it. You have to know the spelling well, so practice that, and you have to make sure you're typing it in correctly, no typos. So you have to be careful and thoughtful when you're taking the lab exam and have to type in your own terms. I would also consider printing off, if you'd like to, printing off the pictures that we've asked you to know and the lab material, and cutting them out, shrinking them, cutting them out, and putting them on flashcards too. And on the back, writing down what that is a picture of. And then when you see our pictures, it should be super easy. You'll be like, oh, I've been studying that all week, that picture. So those are some tips for you. I hope you find them helpful. And as always, let me know if you have any questions. Please remember to email me directly through St. Kate's. Don't use Canvas. Again, once in a while I find an email message on Canvas that I had no idea was sitting there. So they're supposed to come directly to my inbox at St. Kate's, but sometimes they don't. But if you send it directly to me, use my direct email as St. Kate's from yours, I'll get it for sure. So good luck to you this week. Again, let me know if you have any questions, and I will check in with you again soon. Have a good one.